Go Yom Shlishi. Today is the yard site of the Baba Sali. Today is Dalet Shvat. I want to tell you a story that I heard from somebody who heard it directly from Meir Abu Chatzira, Meir Abu Sera. Meir Abu Chatzira is not a descendant of the Baba Sali. He's a nephew of his. In other words, Meir Abu Chatzira's father was the Baba Sali's brother, I think, or even grandfather. Meir Abu Chatzira is a Baal Tshuva, right? He was not always frum. Both, that's nicht. So, but one of his friends who became frum with him said, "Listen, Meir, you may not have always been religious, but if someone will slit your wrist, Zohar will flow." It comes mamish benon shel gedoshim. It's a heilig in mishpacha. So I heard this from someone who heard directly from him, from Meir Abu Chatzira. He was living in America and he was doing macrobiology. He was doing his science that he had developed or learned, I don't know exactly, and he wanted to move to Israel. So he heard that in Brooklyn there's a Psalabavitcher. This is 1972, Tafshin Lamed Beis. So he made an appointment and he went in to see the Rebbe. Now he went in there for a bracha. And the Rebbe tells him, if you're asking me my opinion, you shouldn't move to Israel. You certainly shouldn't move for a year. I think he said, but for sure not for the next 3 months. And he looks at the Rebbe with like, I didn't ask you, Rabbi. I came here for a bracha, not for an eitz. And he tried to squirm. He doesn't know who he's talking to yet. This is not a Rebbe you come to for brachas. It's a Rebbe tells you how to live your life. Bottom line is, the Rebbe would not back away. The Rebbe said, no, I don't think you should go to Israel. He was very disappointed. Like, who is he? Veritas. So he called up the Baba Sali, who was his uncle. And they picked up the phone. And he says to the Baba Sali, who is this Lubavitcher Rebbe guy? When I went into him for a bracha, and he starts telling me, so this is how the story was told to me. The Baba Sali says to him, you're in New York, and you can seek counsel from the Rebbe, and you're calling me? He says, if I could, I would live in New York, and I would sit at his feet. This is what he tells the Meir Abu Chatzira. He says, he tells you stay in America, stay in America. He was so not expecting that kind of an answer. This is a whole other world. Sfadim is a very, very proud world. And there are very good reasons to be proud. Sfardim have a Messiah which is so sacred and so powerful. Ashkenazim make believe Sfardim are nothing. Well, guess what? Sfardim feel the same way about us. And we're both wrong because we don't know their world. The Baba Sali is a Godel. And he was much older than the Rebbe. I think the Baba Sali was born Mem Zayin. I think Baba Sali was almost 100 years. I think he was considerably older than the Rebbe. And when he hears this from the Baba Sali, he was very, very surprised. So this is, again, I'm telling you the story as I heard it. He made another appointment and he went to the Rebbe again. But this time he went in with the gushpanka, with the chsime, with the endorsement of his uncle. So he walked in different. He walked in with an understanding, like it says in Chumash a couple of weeks ago, Shal na'alecha miyal raglecha. Ki amokem ashar ata eimed aleha ad mas kodesh. He walked in a whole other frame of mind. And when he walked in this time to the Rebbe, he saw a different man. And again, I'm repeating the story the way I heard it. He walked into the Rebbe and he started to screech like a madman. I think he came shrieking, Shrayin v'asmardik and Shrayin Kedusha. And the Rebbe had to calm him down. Just telling you a ma'aseh that I heard it about a year ago, and then I made the guy repeat the story for me a second time, and when I'll see him, I'll make him repeat it to me a third time until I get it genoy, b'diyuk. It's a story. The story of the Baba Sali that we like to tell and should tell, because it's really a moed in the kamaisa. It's mamish a moed in the kamaisa. The Baba Sali was living in Eretz Yisrael. This is 1952. Tafshin Beis. The Rebbe was a Rebbe. Of course he stayed in America. The end of the story is, the reason I'm telling the story is because it's the Baba Sali's yard site. We're not interested in the Baba Sali. It's the Baba Sali's sensitivity to the Rebbe that makes us appreciate his bittul to the Rebbe is who his greatness is. It was the very beginning of the Rebbe's Nesius, the very, very beginning, a year, two. The Baba Sali was living in Israel. In other words, Morocco then had hundreds of thousands of Jews. The Baba Sali's son, who would end up passing away before him, Rebbe Meir, was very involved with Lubavitch. I think the Mrs. Lipsker who comes here is his daughter, and he was a tzaddik and a makubal gora gohibin arid. There's a couple of Lubavitch Edims that he has, and the Baba Sali he told his grandchildren-in-law who their shved is, the Meir of Abu Chatzira. But the Baba Sali was already living in Eretz Yisrael, and he wanted to live in America. I don't know why. He wanted to move. And the Rebbe wrote him a letter. And the letter is printed in Nigras Kedesh. You could see it, schwarz auf weiß. And the Rebbe tells him something which he told thousands of leaders, that the captain is the last one to leave the ship. And the Rebbe was so upset about this. All over the world there was recruitment. The Sachnut, the Tziyonim were trying to bring people to Israel. So one of their ploys was to schlep away the leadership, and by schlepping away the leadership, the Amcha would follow. And the Rebbe was so not happy about this. You know, this mitzvah atzmis, kol ateiru kulo imedes aleha, nikra aliyah. You know the story with Shlomo Goren, Olav Shalom. He was a big Rav, a Gon. He was in the Rebbe's room. I heard this from a Malamed of mine many years ago. And Shlomo Goren, Harav Shlomo Goren, asked the Rebbe, in Hebrew he spoke, or maybe he spoke in Yiddish, does the Lubavitcher Rebbe believe in Aliyah? So the Rebbe answers, Ich halt von Yishuv Eretz Yisrael, which is a Rambam and a Ramban, that's a mitzvah to Miyash Mitzvah. So Rav Goren says to the Rebbe, so then halt the Lubavitcher Rebbe von Aliyah. Does the Lubavitcher Rebbe hold of Aliyah? So the Rebbe answers, Ich halt von Yishuv Eretz Yisrael. And they went around and around and around until Goren realized that if he's going to ask it 500 times, he's going to get the same answer. Aliyah. What's Aliyah? Yishuv Eretz Yisrael is a mitzvah. The difference between Aliyah and Yishuv Eretz Yisrael, Yishuv Eretz Yisrael is one mitzvah and Tayag mitzvahs. Ben Gurion, Ve'amid and Alachas, Aliyah, fertig. Ganz Yiddishkeit, es geht in Eretz Yisrael. Wer hat das Machel gewesen? And on what grounds and on what basis? What does it do with Teda? But okay. The Rebbe appreciates Eretz Yisrael, no question about it, but the Rebbe also understands that it's not the whole Yiddishkeit. Yiddishkeit is Yidden. And especially leaders. There's so many letters, and there's so many siches, and there's so many yechidus. When the Rebbe speaks to Gedel Yisrael and says, you're the last one to leave. Because even if the Sachnut succeeds, they bring the leadership, and 80% of the people follow, and come to Eretz Yisrael, and settle in the Holy Land, what happens to the other 20%? Baba Sali was going to come to America. He lived in the Sivis. So the Rebbe wrote him a letter, and he said to him, you have to be where your people are. And he listened. That's the end of the story. He listened. That's the ganze Maaseh. This was a Yid who was older than the Rebbe. He was a real tzaddik. He was a real Baruch HaKodesh. And they say moifsim about him. They say poshet moifsim about him. Azevi Balshemski Maisis. He was a very great person. He had an idea. The Rebbe gave him a different idea. Batel l'tzei necham mepnei l'tzei nei. He did what the Rebbe wanted, not what he wanted. This is Baba Sali. Yidden was kumenish as eine Karsulayim. Jewish people who can't be in the same universe as him, haben verstanden besser. Didn't listen to the Rebbe. But this is how it is. If you look at the last generation, of our generation, the greatest Rabbonim and Rosh Yeshivas and Rebbes listened to the Rebbe. And the ones who were a little bit smaller, they verstanden besser. The story with the Baba Sali, it's half of a feller. I mean, you know how Lubavitchers are. You're never good enough, right? Why? The Rebbe is everything, everybody's nothing. And it's Taka Ebbes. But von deswegen, a Yid, this was not, the Rebbe wasn't the Rebbe for 25 years, the Rebbe was the Rebbe for 25 months. Efter noch weniger. It was Yud Aleph for Yud Beis, the very beginning of the Nesias. And the Rebbe was not so well known. And he somehow, I don't even know if he wrote to the Rebbe. He did or he didn't. Bottom line is the Rebbe says to him, you cannot go where you wish, you have to go where your flock is. And he listened. This is so unbelievably great, there's no words. This Pashat, nicht ein milim. There are no words to express what kind of greatness it is to have this much humility. It's really, really unbelievable. It's mamish unbelievable. And anyway, when it comes to Yartat, they always tell you the same thing. And it's also very important to mention. There's a sefer called Reb Nissen. Reb Nissen is about my wife's grandfather, Reb Nissen Nemenov. Reb Nissen Nemenov was an unbelievable Ovid, a fantastic Ovid. In even Avodah, he was a Echad B'Deidei. There was nobody like him in our generation. No one. Since the Holocaust, there was only one Reb Nissen. And Reb Nissen was a mashpia. He was a madrich of Talmidim. I would say he was mostly a mashpia based on looking at him rather than from his hadracha. He wasn't. Reb Shem Chaim was a mashpia in the sense that he got involved with the Talmidim, and Talmidim related him. Talmidim loved him. You couldn't love Reb Nissen, but you could revere Reb Nissen. This was a tzir. He was a very big chassid. And the Rebbe put Reb Nissen, the Friedricher put Reb Nissen in Brnois in France. So when he started out, he had a huge yeshiva. Why? All of Lubavitch was in France. Everybody came from Russia, or wherever they came from. Anybody joined Lubavitch at the end of the war in Samarkand or in Puking ended up at Temchat Pimim. But by 1954, 55, if someone pulled the plug on the drain, nothing was left. What was Temchat Pimim in the Brnois? What? A few who? The children of the Melamdim. France did not have a grosse kil of Anash. There was not a lot of Talmidim. And the Rebbe would not let him leave. And it would be years, decades, before the idea of traveling overseas would become fathomable. In other words, Lubavitch was so poor, so depressed. The idea that a boy should go from New York to Brnois, or to go from Canada to Brnois, to go from Australia to Brnois, was unheard of. So the yeshiva that he dealt with a kleine heifer. There was a tiny little group of children of Anash. And you scratch your head and say, what did the Rebbe keep him there? Now, of course, you could say, Das Heliyot. The Friedrich put him there, and you cannot make a change. Rabbi Yaakov Lipsker was on a farm, and he came to the Rebbe and said, "There's nothing to do. No one is buying chickens anymore." He was a chicken farmer. The chickens moved to someplace else. The Yidden moved away, so he didn't have not Parnosa Gashmis, not Parnosa Ruchnis, and the Rebbe tells him, "The Rebbe the Shver sent you there. I can't help you. Go to the Friedrich Rebbe." And it was a very, very difficult. You live in a place where you have no Parnosa, not Bagashmis, not Baruchnis, and the Teretz is the Rebbe the Shver said. Then one time in Yechidus, he stopped asking already. He knew the Rebbe was not letting him move. Why? The Rebbe the Shver. In the middle of Yechidus, the Rebbe went into a trance. The Rebbe with a vertracht. And the Rebbe raises his head and said, Lav dafke fan, verkev dem fan, kleib scharib in Stadt. Basically, the Friedrich Rebbe told him, tell him it's enough. I mean, the Rebbe tells him, the Friedrich Rebbe said, I can't change it. Mitamol, the Rebbe forgot that, what? For years, the Rebbe is telling him, the Rebbe the Shver, the Geschichte Verschlichas, I can't take it back. Mitamol, the vergessen das. The Rebbe never let leave. So by the 70s, Bochrim started coming from overseas. And Take, Reb Nissen became a mashpia. So many of the American boys and the European boys at Etmanish learned by him and Temchat Pimim. But for decades, the 50s and the mid-60s for sure, he was talking to a handful of people. The Rebbe wouldn't let him leave. Shumef. So the Das Elyon is that the Rebbe put you there, you're stuck there. But there's a Das Tachten. And the Das Tachten is very deep and serious and real and understandable. What was Temchat Pimim full of in 1955, in 1956, and in 1957, and in 1958, and in 1968, and in 1969, 59, in 1960, and 1961? You know what they're full of? Moroccans. For every European boy, there were 5 Sfardim. Those Moroccans were sent by the Bechol Lipsker Olav Hashalom, and then all the Shluchim that followed him, Reb Shlomo Matasav Olav Hashalom, and all the rest of the Shluchim, Leibel Raskin Olav Hashalom, yeah, we could say Shalom Edelman Zol Gesund Zayin, yeah, and Mrs. Raskin, to Temchat Pimim. Those Sfardim who learned in Lubavitch are the leaders of the Sfardic world all over the world.
They all speak Yiddish.
I know, but they don't have Minhagei Chabad. There was a specific instruction. They should maintain Minhagei Sfarad. And they say now that they understand the Hero. Had they become Lubavitchers, they would never have been able to become their Rabbanim. Harav Amar, the chief rabbi of the Sfardim, is a Talmud of Reb Nissen Nemenov. You need more than this. And this is what Reb Nissen was doing in France. He was taking 4 Kalmansons and 2 Volshanskis and a Nemenov and a half. He was teaching these Sfardim. And here's an amazing thing. The Baba Sali used to come to Brnois, Rish Chedesh Elul, and stay till after Yom Kippur, year after year after year. You imagine that? The Baba Sali is the greatest Sfardic leader of his time. Would leave Eretz Yisrael and sit in a suburb of Paris in a kleine yeshiva, Lebet Reb Nissen, 40 Tag, Rish Chedesh Elul till after Yom Kippur. He did it, I think, for 11 years. from let's say 1953 to 1964, 10 or 11 years in a row. What was his excuse? He wants to be in a holy environment. He loved Rebbe Nissen. He adored Rebbe Nissen. They had a chavruse. I would imagine that Baba Sali was a god. Baba Sali was probably much bigger. Baba Sali was a god will be Yisrael. Rebbe Nissen was no slouch. But Rebbe Nissen didn't have a mind. He didn't have he had a very good memory. Nissen was an unbelievable Ovid. But I don't think Nissen, there's letters from the Rebbe, the early letters, where the Rebbe writes Harav HaGon. For 1 year, Tafshin Zayin, in every letter says Harav HaGon. Then it returns to Tafshin Ches, Harav HaGon disappears. But the Rebbe wrote to Nissen, Kama Briv Harav HaGon. It wasn't a mistake. Why he took it out is a Inyan Pnimi. But the Nissen was not. I think the Baba Sali was probably a Yid who knew like the whole Torah kind of thing. And they learned together. You think the Baba Sali went to France because they couldn't find another holy place? Baba Sali went to France because he knew what the Rebbe knew. That these Bachrim Lach, who are sitting now in Teim Chetmimim, are the future of Yadus Sfarad. That's why he went to France. That's my opinion. When you read Reb Nissen Sefer and you read between the lines, it's not written. It's so clear. The Rebbe kept one of the most important mashpiyim of our time in a depressed place. There were no Talmidim, there was no prospect of getting Talmidim. It would be 15 years, 20 years for Baruch would travel overseas. What was the Rebbe keeping him there? So you could say, Das Alien. The Rebbe the Shretik, Geschicht, Fartik. You know, when Nissen got that job, it was the hottest job in Lubavitch. You know the story? They made them Chatmim, and they had a vad of 3 or 4 big Chassidim. Reb Peretz Mochkin, and Reb Ella Plotkin, and Reb Zalman Shimon Dvorkin, and Reb Shlomo Chaim Kesselman. That's big names. Then Reb Nissen shows up in Paris, and the Friedrich Rebbe writes a letter like as if these people don't exist. Boop. Borach Boyach Sholem Teim Chatmimim is yours. I was once telling my Shved, I told my Shved was his son, Moshe Nemenov. I was telling my Shved that Reb Shlomo Chaim was a mashpia. Reb Shlomo Chaim was a lot older than Reb Nissen. Reb Shlomo Chaim was 10 years older than Reb Nissen, at least. And it's Takapella. Reb Shlomo Chaim was a mashpia in Teim Chatmimim. Along comes Reb Nissen Nemenov, and Reb Chaim says, walks away. My Shved was already sick at the time. My Shved was so underwhelming. My Shved was he was so nachach. He mutters under his breath, "If she's given epis from the Rebbe." Perhaps there was some kind of a comment from the Rebbe. It was before the book came out. When the book came out, you see clearly they made a vad which the Friedrich Rebbe endorsed. And as soon as Reb Nissen showed up in Paris, the vad was ois. And when you look at it, you don't know what to think. Avram Ella Plotkin, he was a godel. Avram Ella Plotkin was a bigger person than Reb Nissen in terms of mahus, kishreinis. Yeah, Peretz Mochkin was also a bigger person than Reb Nissen. But Peretz Mochkin used to sit by Reb Nissen like a child. Such derech eretz. Zalman Shimon and Shlomo Chaim. So now, if you look into the future, you realize something very interesting. In other words, if you can assume, and of course we all do, that the Friedrich Rebbe saw the future, Reb Nissen was the one who ended up without a job, not them. Shlomo Chaim went to Eretz Yisrael, yeah, and you could say that the Shlomo Chaim lost his position. What the Shlomo Chaim got was 10 times what Reb Nissen would have. Shlomo Chaim got the Chelek Ari of Anash's children in Eretz Yisrael. That's what the Lubavitchers were. There weren't Lubavitchers in America, all in Israel. And Shlomo Chaim raised the daughter of Lubavitcher Chassid, no question about it. So it looked like Reb Nissen got the best job. But within a few years, Reb Nissen was left with nothing. So what was he doing here? So again, you could say, as the Rebbe Gewalt, but in my humble opinion, Reb Nissen was mashpia on people who today have the most important rabbonis in the Sfadisha world. Now, I'm not going to say every big Sfadisha over the Talmud Chetmimim, but some of the most important ones are. And the Baba Sali picked himself up from Eretz Yisrael and traveled to Europe and spent 11 Elul and Tishreis from Reish Chodesh Shalach Lafti Kippur with the Chetmimim, and he would get up in the middle of the night and say slichas with these Fadish Abachrim. The Rebbe didn't want to change them in Hagim, and Reb Nissen used to get up also. He hadn't got to sleep. Reb Nissen would sit when they were saying slichas, and this is greatness. I'm now inferring, and I'm much more than inferring. I'm inventing mountains on clouds. But the Rabbi Sali understood what the Rebbe is thinking and what the Rebbe is doing, and he helped him. Who did he help? He helped himself. Who did he help? Lashem Yeshua. If you think about it, Baba Sali's official reason. Do you imagine what's the equivalent? I don't know what the equivalent is in the Ashkenazi world. a person who's considered the greatest rabbi of half of Judaism should pick himself up from his community in the most important time of the year and move to a suburb of a shtetl in a yeshiva in a different community. It's Ashkenazim. Sfardim are very proud, more proud than you can imagine. What did he do it for? So his excuse was he wanted to be in a Heilige Platz, and the Temchatim was like a Heilig. And there was Reb Nissen, and there was Reb Yisrael Neach, and there was Reb Anan Yosef. It was a holy place, the whole staff over there. One was holier than the next. There was what to look at, yeah? I don't think Baba Sali needed Reb Nissen Nemna to give my seders for Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. He appreciated what the Rebbe did. He made a Temchat Mimim. And it started out with so much promise, then everybody left. And that Temchat Mimim was Madrich, a generation of Sfardim. At the time, they were such troublemakers, and they had to fight with them. And You have to read how the Rebbe writes to Reb Nissen. Reb Nissen was going nuts. Why? Sfardim can't relate to Chassidus. It's a whole different world.
And people speak to them.
They spoke in Hebrew. But the bottom line is, the Rebbe said, you keep trying, and you'll get it into their heads. And he worked like you're pounding a hammer into stone. And today, those Yidden are the basis for the Yiddishkeit, maybe hundreds of thousands of people. And the Baba Sali was a shutuf. That's how I see it. But if you think about it, I know many people, and there are many stories. It didn't happen once or twice. The Baba Sali's reverence for the Rebbe knew no bounds. The degree to which he appreciated, first of all, the Rebbe is, and second of all, what the Rebbe is doing, was Ein Safe. People who were like ants next to him, competed with the Rebbe. And he just stood be'ema b'yira b'resta b'zeh. Okay, let's go.